Hello, everyone, and welcome to Lesson 8-1, The Origins of the Civil Rights Movement. African Americans had pushed for equality since before the American Civil War. This was not a new push in the 1950s, but it will gain new traction. And so we're going to be talking about the Civil Rights Movement, which began in the 1950s. Now, this came about because during World War II, factory jobs, good paying factory jobs, helped many African Americans to reach the American middle class. More and more African Americans were able to leave the absolute poverty of American society and enter into something that looked like and felt like affluence, owning houses, owning cars, and being able to have enough money to impact their society. And with this impact, with this influence, American life will change. One of the important changes comes in 1954. In 1954, the Supreme Court of the United States of America overturned a previous Supreme Court ruling and outlawed segregation in American schools moving forward. Segregation had been ruled as legal in the United States, going back to the court case of Plessy versus Ferguson in the 1880s. But now, segregation in public schools is done and gone. This ruling, Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, began this movement that would eventually result in the outlawing of segregation in all public places. Moving beyond this, African Americans rightfully pushed for increased rights in American society. In 1954, Rosa Parks, a hero of the civil rights movement, was arrested in Montgomery, Alabama, for refusing to give up her seat on a segregated bus. On these buses, African Americans were required to sit in the back half of the bus whenever a white passenger requested a seat in the front. Rosa Parks was asked to move and refused to give up that seat, and therefore was arrested for violating that law. We can see her getting booked right here. African Americans then went on to boycott the Montgomery bus system for 13 months. This bus boycott created such financial hardships for the Montgomery bus system that it was eventually ended, and buses were integrated. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was one of the leaders of this bus boycott movement. He had first gotten his name as a preacher in Georgia, but then got involved with civil rights actions. And he shows up at the boycott and helps to advise and motivate these protesters to take a nonviolent approach, that their interests would best be achieved through nonviolent action, through peaceful protest. And this peaceful protest movement is successful. As we just heard, the bus boycott results in the integration of buses, the end of segregation. And after this success, Dr. King helps form a group called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC. And Dr. King will become a national figure in the movement for racial equality and civil rights and the end to segregation. This is not the only time that we will talk about Dr. King. Now, anytime in American society a big social push is made or achieved, there is pushback. Many Southern whites in America did not like this idea of integration. And during the civil rights movement in the 1950s, membership in the Ku Klux Klan, this violent terrorist organization, as well as the White Citizens Council. The White Citizens Council is a less violent, but still extremely racist organization. Membership increases in these groups, and they are able to slow the progress of integration through the American South. One example of this was in Little Rock, Arkansas. See, after the Brown decision, all public school districts were supposed to integrate. They were supposed to allow African Americans to come to what had previously been all-white schools. But some school districts, including that in Little Rock, simply refused to integrate. They said, no, we're not going to do it. There will be no African Americans at our school. Now, these protests, pushback does keep a lot of these districts segregated for a while. But President Eisenhower realizes that, his job is to enforce the law of the land. The Supreme Court of the United States has clarified that the law does not support segregation. So Eisenhower uses the National Guard, uses American soldiers to protect African American students who want to enter Little Rock schools. In particular, these National Guard soldiers were sent down to protect a group known as the Little Rock Nine. The Little Rock Nine were 9 African American students who wanted to attend their local high school in Little Rock, and they needed National Guard protection to enter their own school. But it was achieved, and desegregation of Little Rock did happen. Now, in the early 1960s, the civil rights movement wanted to make sure that they could expand civil rights and desegregation beyond merely public places like the school system. And in order to achieve this goal, they came up with the idea of sit-in protests, of using sit-in protests to achieve their goals. Protesters, both black and white, because there are a number of white supporters of civil rights, would enter these white-only businesses, be they a restaurant or whatever, and they would simply have a seat. They would sit down at a table, at a counter, at wherever, and they would refuse to move, refuse to get up. These protesters might occupy a lunch counter, and while they're sitting there, no customers can come in. And in order to, make room for customers in this white-only business, these individuals would have to be removed. The only way to do that is with police. So you call the police, protesters are arrested, and they're taken down to the local jail. But when there's no longer any room in the jails for more people, and when you're releasing people from the jails and they're going straight back to the counters, the power to stop a protest movement like this is extremely limited. And this is how and why sit-in protests were very successful. Now, protesters did get attacked by segregationists. They were attacked physically, violently, in some instances, by people who wanted to maintain white-only spaces in America. But the violence only encouraged the nonviolent movement. The more violence was used against peaceful protesters, the worse the people using the violence appear. If you are attacking viciously somebody who is sitting peacefully, you look bad. There's no way around that. And sympathy and empathy and goodwill toward the protesters increases as violence is used. And out of this sit-in movement, and out of the realization that nonviolence is an incredibly powerful tool, comes another organization of the civil rights movement that we should know about. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, is born out of this sit-in movement. So today we looked at the starts of the civil rights movement, where African Americans are getting better jobs and more pay, and therefore are able to better organize. We have the Brown decision desegregating public schools, the push to then desegregate in other locations, including the Montgomery bus boycott led by Dr. King and Rosa Parks, and then the push into the sit-in movement as well, and using those protests to help achieve the ends of civil rights. I hope you learned something today and that you enjoyed this lesson. I will see you next time. Farewell.